Hello, everyone. You probably have a few questions about the qualitative essay for POLS2044. Hopefully, I can provide a few answers for the most common questions and address some of the questions that people posted on the Poll Everywhere survey. So I wanted to start with a few main points. One is that this is a qualitative essay. It is one that should be the most similar to essays you've undoubtedly finished for other classes at the ANU, in that it has a traditional essay structure with a beginning, middle, and end, an introduction, framing the question, why it matters, and the structure of the rest of the essay, then a literature review, making your argument, the observable implications of your argument, the way that you are going to go about and evaluate those empirical implications in your hypothesis, given the case study or comparative case study structure in the qualitative research approach, and then discussion and conclusion. There are, of course, different ways of structuring your paper within that loose overall structure. Some people will merge the literature discussion and the argument section. Some will move most of the discussion briefly of the literature in the introduction and focus the argument section. But the main takeaways is that it's a traditional essay structure, and the focus is using the traditional sources of evidence that most undergrads are used to using, but approaching it in a more hopefully transparent research design focus, in that you want to be clear about how your approach matches the scientific method approach that we've talked about over the course of the semester, the ways in which the concepts and theories directly connect to observable implications and cases, and use hopefully some of the terms that we've become comfortable with over the last couple of weeks. So when you're writing an essay, and when I write an essay, I usually recommend that people start with an outline, break it up into different sections, right? That intro, the argument section, evidence section, conclusion, and then break up the other bits within that, usually with section headers, so that it's clear where the reader is within that general essay structure. We've talked in class about the difference between a theory and a hypothesis. So one of the main goals in the tutors and me reading these essays is to what extent you've been able to apply the theories and ideas that we've covered in class and applied it to an area of political science study that is of particular interest to you. And in that kind of gap between theory and evidence that we've talked about in the Concepts and Measures week and other weeks, and we'll be talking about in week 6, I think it's important to spend some time justifying the kind of approach that you've taken to connecting theory to evidence, why the hypothesis is be careful that your hypothesis is clearly worded so that it can be falsifiable, that you're clear about what the null hypothesis is that you're evaluating the hypothesis against, and that you've had some thought about how you've chosen your cases. If it's comparative, is it most similar, most different? Is it a challenging case that if your theory can work there, it's likely to work even more strongly in some other case? Or is it a typical case that you think is representative of that kind of normal distribution of cases that you connect to your theory? So some kind of embedding your theory in the literature and then designing your research design in a way that shows that it is an evaluation of your theory. You're not just trying to prove your theory and that you've chosen a case study that you think is the most credible, but that you're really being critical about the challenges and the opportunities of using this particular research method. And the theory and the research question that you're using now for the qualitative case, we're going to repurpose and think about what we can take with us when we use a different kind of research design related to quantitative methods, as opposed to the qualitative case or comparative case focus research for for this paper in week 6. So start with a clear focus. Make sure that you are trying to incorporate as much of the material that we've covered in class, including the readings. You can be strategic about if you're going to focus on process tracing, if you're going to focus on comparative case study analysis, that we can use the readings that you've already covered in class for that. The essay is only 1,500 words, and so I would think that I would encourage you to try to be realistic for how much you can comfortably cover in that amount of time, and that you do only have a brief 100 to 200 word intro and conclusion. Don't need to cover all the literature, just one or two of the major debates that you're really addressing or building off of. This essay is not about trying to demonstrate that you've done the literature about the general theoretical motivations. The real focus of this essay is applying these research methods to a particular case, being clear about what your argument is and how it's different or interesting or compelling, and how it might speak to a case or multiple cases out in the world. So some students have asked for word breakdown with that. I would say the argument would probably be 500 words ballpark, and then the evidence section and the discussion of other potential explanations for your case would fall into 800 to 1,000 words there. So you want to make sure that you leave space for your case and connecting your theory to your case specifically. And also make sure to try to leave a bit of time to revise. I've read a lot of essays that have had basic grammatical errors, inconsistently formatted bibliographies, things that you would think would come and that you will have time for, but often students don't have time for it. So if you leave yourself some time to read and revise your essay, put it down for a couple hours or overnight, come back to it fresh, and then really focus on structure, clarity, and directness in your writing, it will benefit in making the reader better able to understand your ideas and what you're really trying to say. The bibliography and footnotes don't count towards the word count, so hopefully that'll provide you a bit more flexibility, as well as the ANU's word buffer policy, plus or minus 10%, also applies here, of course. Let's see, let's go to the direct poll everywhere questions that we have. Where do we find qualitative data sets? Question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark. I think that's the right number. There really isn't any such thing like a qualitative data set. The focus is on, and we talked about this in week 3, in trying to understand how cases in the world, either by themselves or comparatively, you can tell a story, to try to look at how an event unfolded or how an outcome came about over time. The data set part will come in the second part of the term. Qualitative evidence is word-based, it's narrative-based, it's looking at a case, looking at the written word, whether secondary academic sources or primary, what people said in the news or in election observation reports or in social media, that this is word-based. It's not coded data. That's going to be the focus of the quantitative discussions that we're going to have in the second half of the class. Do we have to pick one of the 2 referencing styles given in the guide, or can we use any other major referencing guide? Please use the ones that I asked. That I put them there for a reason. They are the default for almost all of the readings that we'll cover in this term. Author, date, in-text citations with Chicago or Harvard or any APSA style complete bibliographic information at the end. The goal for citation styles is to make a paper easy to read, not to distract people with long names and titles of articles in the text, but just Frank 2022 in the paper, and then if I want to know what that paper is, I can go to the bibliography and find it. Footnotes, it can get difficult to find what the particular source information is if the complete source is given on page 2, and then the part that I'm really trying to find out about is on page 5. The goal is to try to make it as easy as possible on the reader. So please use something that you're comfortable with, but I would encourage you to use these simple styles that will stand you in good stead for other political science essays. Third question, can we have multiple parts to the independent variable? In other words, can we seek to determine whether the presence of 3 elements is necessary to cause the dependent variable? This is an interesting question, and we talked about necessary and sufficient conditions in the lecture a few weeks ago. Very few factors are either necessary or sufficient in political science because we do live in a probabilistic, complicated social world, and so I would kind of I would encourage you to think about using such terms like necessary, sufficient, always, must, strong, determinant statements, because that's going to make the reader think, okay, can I find some example that disproves the rule that they're trying to lay down? Of course, with qualitative analysis, as I discussed in the lecture, you have one or a single case, or you have a very small n, a small sample size that you're looking at for your evidence, but you have a whole bunch of rich detail that you can get into and a lot of potentially important causal mechanisms. And the readings and what we've talked about in lecture suggest that these kind of methods can be really useful for looking at the plausibility of a different stories, for generating hypotheses or ideas for quantitative analysis, but often there are going to be many potentially relevant and important factors to explain your outcome, and I would encourage you to be clear about what these different outcomes are, these different factors are, and if you can group them in ways that make sense, all the better. But the goal is to not try to cover everything, right? You can never truly get a snapshot of all potentially relevant factors. The goal is to focus on one factor that you really think is the most interesting or important, and then potential other competing explanations or the interactive synergistic effects of multiple factors that, like we talked about in the essay. So you can include multiple parts, but I would say that it is more to the extent to which it could apply to the specific case, it's highly unlikely that anything would just be necessary or sufficient unless it's part of the definition of what the outcome or the cause is. The fourth question, when I ask for examples of qualitative data, I get told interviews, surveys, etc., but I find these hard relating to such a specific topic. Aside from interviews and surveys, what documents can we use? Surveys are a topic we talked about last week, and that are quantitative data if they're aggregated to get together. Individual interviews or focus groups, those would be things that would be considered more qualitative evidence. It really does depend on your question and your topic. Most essays that undergraduate students write will be based on secondary sources, either in peer-reviewed academic journals or books, or in press reports, election observation mission reports, international organization reports, things that tell you about a specific case, but that don't involve those kind of numbers and multivariate analysis we're going to be talking about in the second half. So these, as I mentioned back in the week 3 with the qualitative data, there isn't a set kind of process for qualitative research like there is for the quantitative, in the sense that the cases are almost infinite and the ways of approaching them are determined by the question you're asking and the argument that you're making. So make sure that the evidence is at the appropriate level of analysis, that the argument is, and that it's from reputable sources, that if the readers are curious, they could follow up and verify the information that you've, or try to understand the process that you use to reach your conclusions. I hope that helps. Okay, the next one, do we have to use data that already exists in previous research papers, copy it in and analyze it, find raw data sets? Again, this seems to suggest that you think that you're using quantitative data for this essay. Not the case. You're using a narrative, story-based word approach to focus on your specific cases. The data side will come soon enough, but that's not the expectation or the mandate for this essay. The goal is to write a qualitative essay with a clear theory and argument, and then approach it using specific cases that you're clear about what the case's boundaries are, either in time or in space. If it's a country, it's easier. If it's a subnational area, you need to make sure that what is it, multiple villages? Is it an administrative unit, a city, or a territory? And what time frame you're looking at the cases. You need to define concretely what the cases are, but it's not using data. What components of the paper should I put the most emphasis on? All of it, but again, this is a research design class, so the focus is on doing a clear, concrete, and sophisticated research design that shows that you can use the terms and methods that we've talked about in class and that political science scholars use in their day-to-day research and writing to be able to teach you to consume that kind of research and be able to produce it yourself. What is the difference in evidence between a normal political science IR essay and a qualitative essay? That's a very good question. I think you should have a clear definition about what type of qualitative approach you have. If it is a single case study, can you find any sources from the course guide or others to be able to try to find whether it is those cases in which you have both the outcome and an explanatory variable, one in which you have neither? Are you selecting on the dependent variable? Concrete details about what your process is that shows that you understand the costs and benefits of using different research designs. So this is a research design class, so that hopefully that structure and clarity and terms that we've talked about would be things that we're going to be looking at as we read through the essays. But then the subject matter will often be quite similar in the cases and the theories that you're looking at, as we can see from the problem statements. What are some phrases we can use to analyze qualitative data, or things that we should mention? I think I addressed that earlier. Look at the slides, look at the readings and the notes, and hopefully with the things that we've defined, things that we've talked about in tutorial and lecture would be things that hopefully you would find relevant in your essay as you proceed through it. How many words should we spend in each part of the paper, or ratio? As always, things depend in a probabilistic world, but as I mentioned before, you don't want to, as with the problem statements, some students put so much effort summarizing the literature and not having their voice come through with their argument, hypothesis, and evidence, that I would rather have fewer sentences talking about the literature and more clear ideas about what your theory is, what your observable hypothesis is, potentially what the null hypothesis is, and what evidence and research design did you use. So keep the literature in a reasonable length, make sure you have room for your argument and your evidence, and then tops and tails, the intro and the conclusion, would be things I usually like to write last when I have a clear idea about what I'm talking about and what are the main takeaways that I want to highlight. I think that is all the questions for today. And with that, I would encourage you to, again, look at the course guide, look at our marking rubric that we're using from the honors theses, and ask any last questions before or after lecture or in tutorial. If you have any last questions as you revise, have a clear structure, have a clear research design, traditional essay structure using qualitative cases or comparative cases, and think about the extent to which you can use what you've learned in the class and be able to apply it. I didn't have exams for this class because the whole goal of using research and to truly learn and internalize things is by actually doing it. So I'm trying to give you the tools and the terms and the ideas for how to develop good theories, what hurdles do good theories have to pass, what kind of research design options are there, with the hopes that you'll be able to apply it. And by applying it in research essays, being able to revise it, to approach it from different angles, you'll come up with an understanding within you about the different steps in research design, the trade-offs that go in with different approaches, and that you'll be able to apply that in other classes or as you consume research over time. So with that, thank you for your time, and I will see you in lecture and tutorial.